Mayuya. Thank you, Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Pingree, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee for allowing me to testify before this committee on NCAI's funding priorities for fiscal year 2027. I'm Mark Macarro. I'm the tribal chairman of the Pechanga Band of Indians in California, and also I am here as the president of the National Congress of American Indians. Founded in 1944, NCAI is the oldest, the largest, and most representative American Indian and Alaska Native organization serving the broad interests of tribal governments and communities. In addition to the comments in my written testimony, I want to focus my remarks today on 5 key concepts. The federal government's relationship with tribal nations is rooted in trust and treaty obligations, yet across Indian country, those obligations remain critically and chronically underfunded and too often under-implemented. We urge the committee to focus on a simple but critical principle. Funding must translate into real-world outcomes in tribal nations and communities. First, we ask you to fully fund core federal trust responsibilities. Programs at the Indian Health Service, the BIA, and the Bureau of Indian Education remain significantly below need. We support advanced appropriations and long-term mandatory funding approaches to ensure stability and certainty for tribal communities. During the recent government shutdown, we saw how advanced appropriations for Indian health services ensured continuation of essential life-saving programs for tribal nations and their citizens, while the lack of advanced appropriation for BIA programs, on the other hand, caused significant harm to tribal communities. Tribal leaders had to face stark choices, for instance, whether to fund law enforcement or social services while furloughing or laying off other tribal government employees. Advanced appropriations would solve that. Second, we urge robust investments in public safety and justice. Tribal communities continue to face some of the highest rates of violent crime in the country and yet remain the least resourced. Funding for law enforcement, courts, and implementation of the Violence Against Women Act tribal provisions must match the scale of the need. We urge this committee to require the immediate release of the fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023 Tribal Law and Order Act reports by BIA Office of Justice Services. These reports provide essential data on the current funding levels for law enforcement, detention, and courts in tribal nations, but more importantly, they document the unmet funding needs for all tribal nations, including those in Public Law 280 states. The fiscal year 2021 report noted that the unmet need was over $3 billion. So that's why we need these other reports. We believe that the FY22 and 23 reports will show an even greater disparity between current funding levels and the actual funding needs to keep our communities safe. Third, infrastructure investments must meet basic standards of living. In many tribal communities, access to safe drinking water, reliable housing, passable roads, and broadband remains limited. Continued investment through agencies like the Department of Housing and Urban Development and other federal partners is essential to closing these gaps. Fourth, we ask you to strengthen tribal self-governance by fully funding contracts and compacts, including contract support costs and administrative needs. Tribal nations consistently demonstrate that when resources are delivered directly, outcomes improve. And finally, and critically, fund the people who make these programs work. We appreciate increased investments in Indian country, but without the workforce to implement them, those dollars don't reach our communities. We just heard an example from the previous panel with the Forest Service, I believe. We urge the committee to fund not just the programs, but the people required to deliver them. Across Indian country, programs are funded on paper, but not fully operational due to staffing shortages. Federal agencies and tribal governments alike face persistent vacancies, limited hiring flexibility, and insufficient administrative funding. Without adequate personnel capacity, even well-funded programs cannot be effectively implemented. Just this week, we learned that the Bureau of Indian Affairs is planning on releasing and implementing a reorganization plan that will make significant cuts to the staff critical in administering programs and distributing funding to tribal nations. In January of this year, the GAO found that the Indian Affairs workforce was reduced by 11% in 2025, and this caused delays in carrying out work, left regions and agencies with critical gaps, and exacerbation of previously identified issues with lack of sufficient workforce capacity. This action has been done without consultation with tribal nations and without consideration of the impact it will have on the delivery of programs and services. Additionally, any reduction in force will impact the tribal share calculation used when a tribe exercises self-governance through an ISDIA agreement. We urge the committee to encourage Indian Affairs to reverse course and engage in robust and collaborative consultations with tribal nations before taking any action that would imperil the already understaffed Indian Affairs workforce. Additionally, we urge the committee to ensure that appropriations include sufficient funding for staffing at federal agencies as well as direct tribal workforce capacity, grant management, financial oversight, and program administration. Expanding administrative cost coverage and supporting workforce development pipelines will ensure that federal investments are actually delivered on the ground. In closing, we ask you to view these requests not as discretionary spending, but as a fulfillment of legal and moral obligations with adequate funding, sufficient flexibility in the workforce to implement programs effectively. Tribal nations can continue to drive meaningful progress for their communities. I thank you for your time and your commitment to Indian country and look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.